You're fired.
Hello, America. Judge Andrew Napolitano here in for Glenn Beck tonight. The budget cut that wasn't. When you cut a budget in the real world, it means you spend less than you did previously. But in Washington, a long way from reality, you can spend more this year than you did last year and still call it a cut, so long as you cut $38 billion from what the president originally wanted to spend. What's absurd is that some Republicans, like House Speaker John Boehner, are championing this deal as a big budget cut, while big government-loving liberals are attacking the deal as a blow to their beloved social spending programs. How are both sides so blind to the fiscal reality? It's not a cut. It's a shell game. The government is spending billions more this year in 2011 than it did last year in 2010, and it's borrowing $1 trillion between now and October just to make ends meet. And while the Congress can't find a way to make real cuts, its members are gearing up to vote yes on raising the debt ceiling. It seems the Congress only knows how to borrow and spend money more each year and not how to cut and spend. Freshman Congressman Justin Amash from Michigan joins me now. Congressman Amash, welcome to the Glenn Beck program.
Thanks for having me on, Judge.
Of course. Why can't the president operate the government without borrowing more money than he collects in taxes and other revenue?
Well, we have a people who become too dependent on welfare, too dependent on spending. We have a military budget that continues to grow, and we have an entitlement problem in this country. Our Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are growing out of control, and we need to reform that for the generations coming up, or we're not going to be able to sustain this country.
Now, when the Democrats controlled the Congress last year, both houses of Congress, they were unable to come up with a budget for this full year, which is why we're 4 months into 2011, but 6 months into the fiscal year, and we don't have a budget for the rest of the year. Each time one of these continuing resolutions has come up, 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there, 5 days there, you have voted against them. I suspect it's because you believe that this is no way to run any kind of a business, much less the largest in the world, the federal government of the United States. What do your fellow Republicans say to you when you keep voting against these efforts to kick the can down the road?
Well, there appears to be a difference in strategy. A lot of my colleagues believe that the strategy is to make the big battle over the debt ceiling, over the 2012 budget. I think we need to fight right now, and that's what I'm doing. The cuts we've seen so far have been tiny. We have this $38 billion deal that supposedly is the largest cut in the history of the country, and during the time we're debating this deal, the deficit increased enough to make up for the cuts.
Right.
I mean, it surpasses the cuts that we made just in the time we negotiated it.
Congressman, I don't think that this is a cut at all. This is really a reduction from what the president planned to spend. This is not any actual savings. In order for the government to do what Congressman Boehner and the president and Senator Reid have agreed to do, it's got to borrow another $1 trillion between now, mid-April, and the end of September, just to make all those payments. How could anybody, except perhaps in Washington, call that a cut or a savings?
That's right. Every year the president proposes a budget. If we come in under that budget, we call it a cut. And that's frankly insane. If the president proposes a $4 trillion budget and we come in a trillion short, that's not a cut. We need to have real cuts from what spending has been in the past.
You are serious about wanting to cut the budget. You're serious about wanting to compel the president to operate the government without any borrowing. Not all of your colleagues are, but some of them have said to my colleagues and me here at Fox and elsewhere, particularly Republicans, particularly conservative Republicans, that they will not vote to raise the debt ceiling unless, and then it changes, unless the president cuts a deal, unless we get a balanced budget amendment. Is there any unless that you would go for, or are you hard and fast that the government borrowing must stop now, and the president's job is to run the government on the basis of the revenue he collects with zero borrowing?
Well, I think it's very unlikely that we can get any sort of deal that would, for example, repeal the health care legislation or introduce a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. If those kind of things don't happen, then of course I can't support any increase in the debt ceiling.
Is there any chance that the House of Representatives will not vote to increase the debt ceiling? Because this is a change in the law, raising the debt ceiling, technically authorizing the Treasury Department to go out and borrow more money. And for a change in the law, of course, both houses have to agree, and then the president has to sign on to it. But if every Republican in the House, or if 3/4 of the Republicans in the House voted against this, that's the end of it. It doesn't even go to the Senate. There is no more borrowing, and the president is forced to do what he never thought he'd have to do, operate the government just on the basis of the revenues he collects. What are the chances, Congressman Amash, of that happening in the next couple of weeks?
I think there's a strong chance. There are a lot of conservative Republicans who have been elected who are not willing to raise the debt ceiling. And we've heard all this hype about the government defaulting. The government will not default if the debt ceiling is not raised. All we'll have to do is cut some spending to live within our means. If we do that, we'll be just fine.
How do you address the complaints of Democrats who say grandma's going to starve and Junior won't have his school bus and the other kids won't get their Pell Grants, their scholarships for college? Stated differently, how would you address the sort of social welfare things that the federal government does, which you and I believe are nowhere authorized under the Constitution, but which it has been doing, and on which people have been relying since Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House?
Well, we need to return our federal government to what it was originally intended to do, to defend the country, to defend Americans so that we can live freely here, to defend our borders, and leave things like welfare programs and other programs to the states and to local governments, and preferably to private industry.
Got it. Congressman Justin Amash, Republican of Michigan, standing firm on the Constitution. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Judge. And please check out my Facebook page, facebook.com/Rep. Justin Amash.
You got it. Here with me now, the ranking member on the Senate Budget Committee, Alabama Republican Senator Jeff Sessions. Senator Sessions, we understand you just ran out of a committee meeting, and we're deeply grateful for accommodating our schedule. And even though it's Judge Napolitano, welcome to the Glenn Beck program.
Thank you, Judge.
What did you think of the deal that was cut by the White House and the House Republican leadership and Senator Harry Reid? Is this something you can vote for, or is this just, in your view, as it is in mine, cosmetic?
Judge, I think it's pretty significant, and I'm going to vote for it. It represents about 2/3 of what the Republicans asked for, and it's a savings in 1/2 of the fiscal year between now and September 30th. And as has been said, we got to have a real serious discussion about the next fiscal year's budget and what kind of reforms we have to insist on as part of any kind of debt limit increase.
All right. Now, that discussion will come in the next couple of weeks because, as you know, the Treasury is perilously close, or from the point of view of fiscal hawks, happily close to the limit of its legal ability to borrow. Stated differently, in about 2 or 3 weeks, the president will come to the Congress and say, I want to borrow another $1 trillion and I need the authority to do it. Will Jeff Sessions from Alabama vote to let the president continue borrowing and digging deeper that $14.3 trillion abyss that we're standing on the edge of?
Well, I would just say it this way. The American people are saying to their children in Washington, get real, get this debt under control, and we've got to make fundamental changes. We have overspent our credit card much quicker than we ever thought would happen. The debts are so much larger than we projected just a few years ago.
Right.
So we've got a very serious national crisis that we need to confront, put ourselves on a road to prosperity instead of a debt crisis. And, excuse me. So I'd like to see what kind of reforms are possible. And I think that this president thinks he can just waltz in and say, take it or leave it. If you don't give us a clean debt limit increase, we're going to blame you with shutting down the government or not paying our debts. I think he's sadly mistaken.
All right, we just had some interesting numbers up on the screen with which I think you're no doubt familiar. In February of 2011, the government borrowed $232 billion. That's more than it's ever borrowed in any other month. In March of 2011, it borrowed $188 billion. In the first half of this fiscal year, $829 billion. Do you think there's any way, Senator Sessions, that the president can be stopped that the executive branch can be stopped from this borrowing without the Congress saying you don't have the legal authority to do it? Is there any promise he could make to you that you would rely on that would induce you to let him go out and do this kind of borrowing again?
Well, it's it's a good question. I think Congress ultimately, as you know, Judge, has the power of the purse. We don't have to spend a dime. We don't have to give the president authority to spend any money. So Congress needs to assert itself. We've just got the difficulty in the Senate, which is one half of the process, not being willing to make any tough cuts. And one of the more amazing things, unappreciated, is the fact that in the State of the Union, in his budget, the president has not even begun to discuss the serious threat this nation faces, as his own debt commission has told him we do. So we're trying to fight a battle for the future of America with the president on the sidelines.
Last question, Senator Sessions. Tomorrow afternoon, when the president addresses the nation, I can't even say this with a straight face, he's going to ask for tax increases in the midst of the worst recession in modern times. How will that set with Republicans on Capitol Hill?
I don't think it's going to set well at all. This is a spending problem, not a problem that the American people don't send enough money to Washington. That's not the problem. The problem is spending, spending, spending. It's surged out of control, and we can get it under control. It's not going to be easy. The hole we're in today is much deeper than it was in '95 when we balanced the budget in 3 or 4 years. It's a deeper hole that requires more sustained, serious, mature effort and focus, and the president is basically been saying, don't worry, I've submitted a budget that lives within our means, that pays down our debt, which has been shown to be utterly false.
Senator Jeff Sessions from Alabama, thanks very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
The White House today warned Congress not to hold the vote on the debt ceiling hostage. Press Secretary Jay Carney had this to say.
A game of chicken with our economy is a hugely risky affair that will not just be a game of who wins and who loses in the political sweepstakes here in Washington, but will have a catastrophic and direct impact on economies around the world and on Americans here.
A game of chicken, he calls it. Meanwhile, House Speaker John Boehner says his party, the Republicans, will not vote to raise the limit unless serious changes are made. Earlier today, he called on the president to demonstrate leadership. Are we headed for another budget battle over this time over the debt ceiling? Arizona Republican Representative Jeff Flake, a fiscal hawk, a fiscal conservative, joins me from Capitol Hill. Representative Flake, it's a pleasure. Welcome to the Glenn Beck program. How do you see this playing out? Do you see the deal that was cut by the president and Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Reid as being adopted on this Friday, and then the battleground becoming the debt ceiling? Or do you think that enough small government, fiscally conservative Republicans will say $38 billion, that's nothing. We borrowed $100 billion during the time we were debating over the $38 billion, and not enough of them will even vote for that?
Well, I can tell you, as you mentioned, more was borrowed during the time it took to negotiate the package than we actually saved. And so we've got to use the debt limit increase as leverage to actually put a cap on spending. Spending cuts are fine, but we can see that the White House is unwilling to agree to many of those or to significant cuts at all. So what we need are enforceable spending caps. So when Congress fails to hit the spending reduction targets, there are automatic rescissions that take place across the board. And so that's what we've got to have, and a number of us will not vote for the debt limit increase unless those are attached.
Congressman Flake, do you trust the President of the United States or the Secretary of the Treasury to abide by these caps? Wouldn't it only be the power of the law that says you cannot borrow more than $14.3 trillion that would force them to run the government just with the money they collect from taxes and other revenue?
Well, the beauty of our system is Article 1 gives Congress the power of the purse, so the president can't spend any money that we don't give him. It's difficult right now because the Democrats control the Senate, and they don't seem much more inclined to cut spending than the president does. But if Congress doesn't give the president the money, he can't spend it. And if we have our own rules which prohibit us from actually spending that money, automatic rescissions that take place. That's the way to solve the problem.
Do you accept the argument of your colleague in the Senate, Pat Toomey, who was an economist before he became the senator from Pennsylvania, that the government does collect enough in revenue and taxes to pay the debt service and to run the government at the same time? Or do you accept this doomsday argument that we just heard from Jay Carney, the president's press secretary, that if you don't let the president borrow more money, we're going to default on our debt, and that will cause all kinds of Armageddon in the economic communities?
Well, I think all of us recognize when you run up bills, you've got to pay them. And the debt limit increase is basically paying off the bills that we've already accrued. So I'm not disputing the fact that we need to raise the debt limit, but what I'm saying, it would be very irresponsible of Congress to, when you pay off those debts, just allow it to continue and go and go and go and do this again and again and again. The president, remember, the budget that he presented would double the national debt in just a few years. And so we can't go that direction. If we're going to raise the debt limit, then attach enforceable spending caps to it, and that's what we've got to do.
If the president doesn't attach enforceable spending caps, if the Congress doesn't enact a balanced budget resolution,
right,
will Congressman Jeff Flake of the state of Arizona vote against raising the debt ceiling?
I can tell you, unless we have enforceable spending caps, and that'll be the Congress that does that, not the president. Unless the Congress enacts enforceable spending caps, then it won't get my vote.
You see, here's the difficulty with that, and we have less than a minute. I could see the House doing that, but I can't see the Senate doing that because it's controlled by the Democrats. They, as you pointed out, want to spend. The only thing the House can do on its own is say no to more borrowing, and without an affirmative vote from the House, that legislation wouldn't even make its way to the Senate.
Well, I think the nice thing is people across the country recognize that we can't go on like this, and so I think that they'll insist, along with the House, that we have enforceable spending caps. So that's I think the strength of our position is people across the country agree with us.
Right.
They recognize we can't go on like this, and so I think we're in a strong position here in the House.
Congressman Jeff Flake, maybe in a year and a half, Senator Jeff Flake, it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Round one of the budget battle is over.